Mom slid a thick manila folder across the dining table to Lauren, and my stomach dropped before she even spoke. The Sunday afternoon light filtered through the kitchen window, catching the edge of the document inside. We'd gathered for what I thought was a normal family dinner, but the formal way Mom cleared her throat told me this was something else. "I've decided to give you your inheritance early," Mom announced, looking directly at Lauren with warmth I hadn't seen directed at me in years. "The cash accounts, the investment portfolio, and partial ownership of the lake cabin." Lauren's face lit up like Christmas morning. She pulled the folder toward her, flipping through pages of official-looking documents. My heart pounded as I watched the scene unfold, feeling suddenly like an outsider in my own family. I asked one simple question, keeping my voice neutral. Did Dad's original will say anything about early distributions? The room went completely silent. Mom's expression hardened instantly. "Don't be greedy, Claire," she said coldly. Lauren smirked at me from across the table. "You've always been bitter about everything. Can't you just be happy for me?" I didn't respond. I excused myself quietly, and when I passed through the hallway, I pulled out my phone and took a quick photo of the document Mom had left on the side table. My hands were trembling, but something in my gut told me I needed evidence. That night, I stared at my phone screen, unable to sleep. I zoomed in on the photo, examining every line of text. The document wasn't just a simple gift transfer. It was structured through something called a trust amendment with formal legal language. I zoomed in further, squinting at the date in the corner. My breath caught. The amendment date was only 2 weeks old. Mom had made this decision recently, quickly, without ever mentioning it to me. Dad had died 8 months ago after a long battle with cancer. Those final weeks in hospice had been brutal, but he'd been lucid almost until the end. He talked to me about the estate, about making sure things were handled properly. I remembered his exact words, though at the time I hadn't understood why he'd seemed so insistent. Something about this didn't add up. The timing felt wrong. The secrecy felt wrong. And Mom's immediate defensive reaction to my single question felt especially wrong. I started searching through my emails, looking for anything Dad might have sent about the trust. There had to be something I was missing, some piece of information that would explain why Mom had done this so suddenly. At 2 a.m, I drove to my storage unit where I'd kept boxes of Dad's papers. I'd been the one to organize everything after his death, sorting through decades of financial documents while Lauren had been too emotional to help. I found the estate binder in the third box. My hands shook as I flipped through pages, scanning for anything about early distributions. Then I found it, highlighted in yellow in Dad's own handwriting, an equalization clause. The clause was clear. If any beneficiary received assets from the trust before final distribution, the estate had to ensure equal value was given to all beneficiaries. It wasn't optional. It was mandatory. I sat back on the cold concrete floor, letting this sink in. Dad had known. He'd protected against favoritism legally, formally, in a way that couldn't be ignored. I remembered now, sitting in the hospice room while Lauren was getting coffee. Dad had gripped my hand and made me promise something. "Make sure it stays equal," he'd whispered. I wrote it down. At the time, I'd thought he was just worried about fairness in some abstract way. Now I understood he'd been giving me a mission to protect his final wishes. The next morning, I drove to the lake cabin. I pulled out the property documents I'd copied from Dad's files and spread them across the dining table. I'd assumed the cabin was entirely Mom's now, but as I read through the trust documents more carefully, the situation was far more complicated. The cabin wasn't fully Mom's to give away. According to the trust, the property remained partially governed by the estate until final distribution to beneficiaries. Any transfer of partial ownership triggered specific legal requirements, a mandatory appraisal, tax reassessment, and IRS documentation. I pulled up the county assessor's website. The cabin's last appraisal was from 5 years ago, when property values were significantly lower. This area had become incredibly desirable since then. If the transfer triggered a new appraisal, the property taxes would skyrocket. And according to the trust structure, whoever held ownership was responsible for those taxes. Lauren had just accepted partial ownership of a property with tax burdens she probably hadn't anticipated. Then I remembered something. Lauren had mentioned at dinner last month that she and her husband Kevin had refinanced their house. She'd said something about getting ready for a big investment. I scheduled a consultation with the family's longtime estate attorney, Marcus Foster. He'd handled Dad's estate planning for over a decade. I didn't tell Mom or Lauren I was meeting with him. This was just information gathering. Marcus's office was downtown, all dark wood and law books. He listened carefully as I explained what had happened at Sunday dinner. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that made my stomach flip. The early distribution legally counts as an advance against Lauren's share. When we do the final accounting, if the values have shifted significantly, she may owe money back to the trust. I stared at him. Owe money back? It's standard in equalization clauses, he explained. Your father was very specific. If one beneficiary receives assets early, we calculate the value at the time of transfer. Then, at final distribution, we assess whether the total estate has gained or lost value. Has the estate lost value? I asked. Marcus pulled up a spreadsheet. The investment portfolio Mom had transferred to Lauren had been calculated at its peak value 2 months ago. Since then, the market had experienced a significant correction. The portfolio's current value was down nearly 18%. Lauren sold some of those investments immediately, didn't she? Marcus asked. I thought about Lauren's social media posts about her kitchen renovation. Yes, I said quietly. I spent the next week quietly gathering information. The market correction had been brutal. The investments Mom had transferred to Lauren at peak value had dropped sharply in the 2 months since. Lauren had sold a significant portion immediately to fund her kitchen renovation, posting photos of new marble countertops, custom cabinets, fancy appliances. Now I knew how she'd afforded it. She'd funded it with inheritance money, selling investments at a loss during a market downturn. And selling those investments immediately had triggered capital gains taxes she hadn't anticipated. The investments had been held in Dad's name for decades, with significant unrealized gains. I pulled up my own modest investment portfolio, the one I'd built slowly over years of careful saving. I understood the basics of tax advantage, timing, and market cycles. Lauren had just made a series of expensive mistakes, and she had no idea the consequences were coming. I felt a strange mix of emotions. Part of me felt vindicated. Part of me felt guilty for feeling that way. And a bigger part felt sad that Mom's favoritism and Lauren's entitlement had created this situation. Thanksgiving dinner at Mom's house was tense from the moment I walked in. Lauren's renovated kitchen was the centerpiece of every conversation. She gave tours to relatives, showing off the custom tile backsplash, the professional-grade stove, the wine fridge. Mom stood beside her beaming, telling everyone how she'd helped her responsible daughter. I sat at the kids' table, even though I was 32, and listened to aunts and uncles praise Lauren's success. Nobody asked about my life, my job as a medical researcher, my recent publication. I was invisible, as usual. After dinner, while Lauren showed off her new espresso machine, I mentioned casually to Mom that I'd been reviewing Dad's estate documents. I said that early distributions were subject to reconciliation according to the equalization clause. I kept my tone neutral, informational. Mom's face went rigid. What are you talking about? Dad's trust has an equalization clause. If one beneficiary receives assets early, the other has to be made whole with equivalent value. Lauren appeared in the doorway, her expression shifting from confusion to anger. Are you threatening us? At Thanksgiving? I'm not threatening anyone. I'm explaining what Dad's trust says. Stop trying to ruin this, Mom hissed. You've always been jealous of your sister. I stood up, exhausted. I'm not jealous. I'm just telling you what the legal documents say. That night, Marcus Foster sent an email. He'd sent a formal request to Mom for documentation of the early distribution. The legal process was beginning. 2 weeks after Thanksgiving, I was scrolling through Lauren's social media when I found something that made my blood run cold. She'd posted a photo with Kevin, both holding champagne glasses, with a caption about exciting new business ventures. The location tag was for some startup tech company. I did some searching. The business was an app development company Kevin had started with two partners. They'd been seeking investors, and apparently, Lauren had become one. I found a local business journal article mentioning the company had recently received private investment. I called Marcus Foster immediately. Lauren used part of the inheritance as collateral for a business investment. There was a heavy pause. That's problematic. If she's put trust assets at risk in a business venture, and that venture fails, it affects the total estate value permanently. What if the business is struggling? Then we have a serious problem. I'll need to request additional documentation from Lauren about where the inherited assets went. I hung up and sat in the dark, feeling sick. I hadn't wanted this to become a legal battle. I just wanted fairness. I looked up the tech company Kevin had started. Their website looked professional but vague, full of buzzwords. Their social media had lots of posts but few actual clients. It had all the hallmarks of a struggling startup. The mandatory cabin appraisal came back in December. The property value had increased by 42% since the last assessment. The county immediately adjusted the property tax rate, and the new annual tax bill was astronomical, nearly triple what it had been. According to the trust documents, Lauren was now financially responsible for her portion of those taxes. And because she held partial ownership, she couldn't simply walk away without triggering more tax implications. I received a copy of the appraisal report from Marcus. Attached was a note. Your mother didn't budget for this. Lauren is disputing the assessment, but the numbers are accurate. I thought about the cabin, about childhood summers there, learning to swim in the lake, reading on the dock while Dad fished. It had been a place of peace. Now it was becoming a source of financial stress and family division. Mom called that evening, her voice sharp. The county sent us a massive tax bill. This is your fault. I didn't request the appraisal, Mom. It's automatically triggered by property transfers. Dad's trust requires it. You could make this go away. No, I can't. This is legal process following Dad's rules. I didn't create these rules. He did. She hung up without saying goodbye. The meeting at Marcus Foster's office in January was brutal. Mom and Lauren sat on one side of the conference table, me on the other. Marcus had prepared a detailed presentation of the estate's current status, complete with spreadsheets. The trust requires equalization, Marcus explained. When Lauren received the early distribution, it was valued at the time of transfer. Since then, market conditions have changed significantly. To equalize the distribution, Claire is owed a substantial sum. He turned his laptop to show the spreadsheet. The number made Lauren gasp audibly. After accounting for market losses, capital gains taxes, and the cabin's increased value, the equalization amount was far more than what remained liquid. Mom looked stunned, her face pale. There must be some mistake. There's no mistake, Marcus said gently. These are straightforward calculations based on the trust's equalization formula. Lauren turned to me, her expression a mix of shock and rage. You orchestrated this. I didn't orchestrate anything, I said steadily. I asked one question about Dad's will. Everything that's happened since then is just the legal process following Dad's rules. But why didn't you warn us? I asked at Sunday dinner, remember? You called me bitter. Mom called me greedy. The silence was thick. Marcus cleared his throat. We need to discuss payment options. The trust requires this equalization. It's not optional. Lauren's hands shook as she looked at the spreadsheet. We don't have this kind of money liquid. We invested it. We used it for the renovation. Then we need to explore alternative payment structures, Marcus said. Installment plans, asset liquidation, or property sale. Mom made a small sound, almost like a wounded animal. The reality of what she'd done was finally becoming clear. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about something Dad had said during one of our last conversations in hospice. He'd mentioned email, about making sure to read his emails carefully. I opened my laptop and searched my email for anything from Dad's address. I found folders I'd archived after his death. Now I forced myself to scroll through them. Then I found it, sent 3 years ago to both Lauren and me, with the subject line, Important, estate planning discussion. The email was detailed and clear. Dad explained that he'd updated his trust to include an equalization clause. He wrote about fairness, about making sure both daughters were treated equally. He specifically mentioned that if either of us received an early distribution, the other would be entitled to equivalent value. Lauren had replied at the time, "Dad, this seems overly complicated. Mom will handle everything fairly. I trust her judgment." She dismissed it. She'd been told explicitly about the equalization clause and had brushed it off. And now she was acting like I'd ambushed her. I forwarded the entire email thread to Marcus Foster with a simple note. "For the record." He replied within an hour. "This is very helpful. It demonstrates that all parties were informed well in advance." February brought bad news for Lauren. Kevin's tech startup was imploding. I learned this from a local business article about failed ventures during the economic downturn. The company had burned through investor capital without achieving profitability and was closing operations. That meant Lauren's investment, funded by her early inheritance, was gone. Completely gone. The money she'd used as collateral for Kevin's business dream had vanished. I also learned, through whispered conversations at a family gathering, that Kevin's job was unstable. His company was going through layoffs. Lauren's income as a part-time real estate agent was sporadic. They'd been living beyond their means even before the inheritance, and now they'd blown through over half the money in less than 4 months. Marcus called me on a Tuesday. The trust reconciliation meeting is scheduled for next month. I've reviewed all the documentation. The numbers are clear. Lauren's early distribution, combined with her subsequent financial decisions, has created a significant imbalance that must be corrected. What happens if they can't pay? Then we explore asset liquidation. In most cases, that means selling property. I thought about Lauren's renovated house, about the cabin, about all the ways this could get worse. The reconciliation meeting was on a Monday morning. I arrived early, my stomach in knots. Mom and Lauren arrived exactly on time, neither making eye contact with me. Marcus laid out the spreadsheets with professional precision. The numbers were damning. When Dad had died, the estate's total value was calculated. Mom's early distribution to Lauren had been based on that value. But since then, the market had shifted. Lauren had sold investments at a loss, triggered taxes, and invested in a failed business. To equalize the distribution, I was owed far more than what remained liquid in the estate. Lauren's face had gone completely pale. Kevin sat beside her, jaw clenched, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else. "There must be payment options," Mom said, her voice strained. Marcus nodded. "Yes. An installment plan over several years, secured by assets. Or liquidation of property to generate immediate funds. Or Lauren could transfer ownership stakes in remaining assets." "How long would an installment plan take?" Lauren asked quietly. "Based on the amount owed and reasonable payment calculations, approximately 8 years. 8 years of monthly payments to me, to correct the imbalance Mom had created. 8 years of being financially tied to a family that had called me greedy for asking one question." I felt no triumph, just deep, tired sadness. After the meeting, Mom pulled me aside in the parking lot. Her eyes were red. "You're tearing this family apart. Your father would be ashamed." I looked at her, really looked at her. Dad wrote these rules specifically because he knew something like this might happen. He protected against favoritism. He made it legally binding. I'm not tearing anything apart. I'm just enforcing what he wanted. You could waive it. You could let it go. Why should I? Because I've always been the one who handles things? Because I'm supposed to be fine without what I'm legally entitled to? Because Lauren needs it more? Mom flinched. "That's not what I meant." "Yes, it is. You've always believed I'd be fine without support because I'm capable. But capable doesn't mean I don't deserve equal treatment." Dad understood that. "Why don't you?" She had no answer. She turned and walked to her car. That night, Marcus called. "Lauren has proposed selling the cabin to generate the funds needed for equalization." My heart sank. The cabin, reduced to a financial transaction to fix Mom's mistake. What are the tax implications? Substantial. Selling the cabin this soon after the partial transfer triggers additional taxes and penalties. The timing of your mother's decision has trapped them financially. Marcus sent me a detailed report on the cabin sale implications. The numbers were staggering. If they sold the cabin, the recent transfer and rapid sale would trigger significant capital gains taxes, early transfer penalties, and other complications. They'd lose nearly 30% of the sale price to taxes and fees. And property values, like investment values, had started to dip. The cabin that had appraised so high might sell for less in the current market. They were trapped where every option led to loss. Lauren called me on a Saturday morning. Her voice was small, defeated. "Can we meet for coffee? Just you and me." We met at a quiet cafe. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes. "I'm begging you," she said quietly. "Just waive it. Sign away the equalization claim. We can't do this. The business failed. Kevin might lose his job. We're drowning." I stirred my coffee carefully. "Why should I?" "Because we're sisters. Because families should help each other. Families should treat each other fairly," I said. "Dad thought so. That's why he wrote the equalization clause. You were told about it 3 years ago, Lauren. You knew this rule existed." I didn't think Mom would actually distribute anything early. But she did. And she gave everything to you. Not half to each of us. Everything to you. And when I asked one question about it, you called me bitter, and Mom called me greedy. Lauren's eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry. But please, this is going to destroy us financially. I'll counter with the installment plan Marcus recommended. 8 years, reasonable payments, legally documented. It's fair, it's achievable, and it honors Dad's wishes. 8 years of debt to you. 8 years of correction for an imbalance that should never have happened." She realized then that I wasn't operating from emotion. I was being strategic, following the legal framework Dad had created. She couldn't manipulate me because I wasn't making personal decisions. I was enforcing legal obligations. The installment plan took weeks to negotiate. Marcus drafted formal agreements, payment schedules, interest rates that were fair but firm. Lauren and Kevin reviewed everything with their own attorney. During this process, extended families started asking questions. Aunts and uncles who'd praised Lauren's renovation at Thanksgiving began to understand the full picture. The story wasn't Lauren got early inheritance. It was Mom gave Lauren everything and called Claire greedy for asking about it. The narrative shifted. At Christmas, I noticed people treating me differently. Uncle Barry asked how I was doing with genuine concern. Aunt Teresa hugged me tightly and whispered, "Your father would be proud you stood up for what was right." Mom's social standing in the family began to crack. People started questioning her judgment, her favoritism, her decision to bypass Dad's careful planning. She looked diminished somehow, avoiding conversations. I felt no satisfaction in this. I never wanted to turn the family against Mom. I just wanted fairness. In February, Lauren's financial situation worsened. The mortgage company requested extensive documentation for a refinance application, trying to consolidate debt. But when the bank reviewed their financial situation, they discovered the inheritance that had been spent, the failed business investment, and the pending equalization debt. The inheritance now appeared as a liability, not an asset. They'd received money, spent it, and now owed a significant portion back. No bank wanted to refinance under those circumstances. Kevin called me one evening, his voice tight with stress. "This is destroying us. Lauren barely sleeps. We're fighting constantly." "I'm sorry she's struggling," I said honestly. "But I didn't create this situation. Mom created it by making an unfair distribution. Lauren made it worse by spending the money immediately on renovations and bad investments. There has to be some compromise. The installment plan is the compromise. Marcus could have insisted on immediate full payment. The plan gives you 8 years. He was quiet. She calls Mom every night, crying. Mom keeps saying this is your fault. Mom can say whatever she wants. The legal documents say otherwise. After we hung up, I sat in silence and wondered if I was being too harsh. But then I remembered Sunday dinner, remembered being called greedy for asking one question. I remembered every time Lauren had been praised while I was invisible. This wasn't about revenge. This was about finally being treated as equal. March brought a breaking point. Mom called me on a Tuesday evening, her voice trembling in a way I'd never heard. Not angry, but fragile. "Claire, I need you to fix this." "Fix what, Mom?" "This whole situation. Lauren can't sleep. Kevin's job is unstable. They're talking about selling their house because they can't manage the debt and the payments." "I didn't create their debt, Mom. You did. When you gave Lauren everything early, when you ignored Dad's equalization clause, when you called me greedy for asking about it." Long pause. When Mom spoke again, her voice cracked. "I made a mistake. I thought I was helping Lauren when she needed it. I didn't think through the consequences." It was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever received. But it wasn't enough. "Did you ever plan to tell me?" I asked quietly. "About the early distribution. If I hadn't been at Sunday dinner, would you have ever mentioned it?" Silence. Long, damning silence. "I thought you'd be fine without it," she finally said. "You've always been so capable, so independent. You don't seem to need help the way Lauren does." And there it was. The golden child favoritism laid bare. Lauren needed help, so she deserved everything. I was capable, so I deserved nothing. "Capable doesn't mean I don't deserve equal treatment," I said, my voice shaking. "Strong doesn't mean invisible." Dad understood that. He wrote it into the trust specifically because he knew you might not understand it on your own. Mom was crying now. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I labeled you greedy because I couldn't face my own mistake." I closed my eyes, feeling tears run down my face. "I need time, Mom." We said goodbye, without resolution. But something had shifted. For the first time ever, Mom had admitted she'd been wrong, had acknowledged the favoritism. It was incomplete and painful, and not nearly enough, but it was something. The mediation took place in April. We hammered out the final details of the installment plan. Lauren and Kevin would pay me a specific amount monthly for the next 8 years. The payments were calculated to account for reasonable interest and to preserve the trust structure as Dad had intended. The agreement was formal, legally binding, documented in triplicate. Lauren's hands shook as she signed the papers. Kevin looked pale and defeated. Mom watched from the side, her expression unreadable. When the signing was complete, Marcus shook everyone's hands. "This plan preserves the trust's integrity and honors the decedent's wishes. It's a fair resolution." Fair. The word hung in the air. It was fair legally, mathematically, morally. But it still felt painful, still felt like watching my family fall apart over money and favoritism and mistakes that could have been avoided. As part of the resolution, Lauren and Kevin had to downsize. They couldn't manage their current mortgage, the renovated house's higher property taxes, and the monthly payments to me. Their realtor had already suggested a smaller home in a more affordable neighborhood. I thought about Lauren giving tours of her newly renovated kitchen at Thanksgiving. Now she'd have to sell it all. 2 months after the mediation, Lauren listed her house for sale. The renovated kitchen she'd been so proud of, the custom cabinets and marble counters funded by inheritance money, all of it was photographed and posted online for strangers to critique. Extended family connected the dots quickly. People understood now what had happened. Lauren had received early inheritance, spent it immediately on luxuries and bad investments, and now had to downsize to correct the imbalance. The golden image cracked publicly. At a cousin's wedding in June, I watched Mom sit alone at a table, avoiding eye contact with relatives who had questions. Lauren and Kevin didn't attend, claiming scheduling conflicts, but everyone knew the truth. They were ashamed. I felt complicated emotions. I'd never wanted public humiliation for them. I just wanted fairness. But consequences don't stay private. Aunt Teresa sat down beside me during the reception. "Your father would be proud of you," she said quietly. "He always said you had a strong moral compass." "I just asked one question," I said. "That's all I did. I asked about Dad's will. And they called you greedy for it. But you weren't greedy. You were protecting your father's legacy." The first installment payment hit my bank account in August, exactly as scheduled. The amount wasn't life-changing, spread over 8 years as it was, but it represented something more important than money. It was recognition. It was acknowledgement that Dad had intended equal treatment for both daughters, and that his wishes mattered even after death. Lauren sent a brief email confirming the payment. No personal message, no additional commentary. Just a transaction notification, cold and formal. I replied with equally brief confirmation. We were sisters now only in the most technical, legal sense. The relationship we'd had, whatever it had been, was gone. Maybe it had never been real. Maybe the golden child and the invisible child could never truly be siblings. I visited the cabin alone on a Saturday in September. Mom had given me a key when they decided not to sell it. The property taxes were manageable if they tightened their budget elsewhere, and selling would have been too emotionally painful and financially complicated. I sat on the dock where Dad used to fish, watching the water reflect the autumn sky, and felt him there somehow. Felt his presence in the careful way he'd structured the trust, in the equalization clause he'd known would be necessary. Mom called on a Sunday evening in October. Not demanding, not accusing, but tentative. "How are you doing?" The question was so simple, but I couldn't remember the last time she'd asked it. My whole life, she'd assumed I was fine because I appeared capable. She'd never checked, never asked. "I'm okay," I said, unsure if it was true. "Would you want to have lunch sometime? Just you and me?" I hesitated. Part of me wanted to refuse, wanted to maintain the distance that had protected me. But another part, the part that remembered being a little girl who loved her mother, wanted to try. "Maybe," I said. "Let me think about it." "I understand. Take your time." We talked for a few more minutes about neutral topics. But the conversation felt different. The power dynamic had shifted. Mom wasn't dictating or assuming or dismissing. She was asking, carefully, tentatively, like someone who'd learned they didn't have all the answers. I thought about Dad's promise, about keeping things equal. He hadn't just been talking about money. He'd been talking about respect, about recognition, about treating both daughters as equally deserving of love and consideration. Mom was starting to understand that, slowly and painfully. By December, a year after the Sunday dinner that had changed everything, I'd found a kind of peace. Not happiness exactly, not resolution of all conflicts, but a stable place where I could stand and know I'd done the right thing. The legal battle was over. The installment plan was being honored. Lauren and Kevin had sold their house and moved to a smaller home. Mom had apologized, awkwardly and incompletely, but genuinely. Extended family had adjusted their understanding of the family dynamics. And I had enforced Dad's wishes. I had protected his legacy. I had proven that I wasn't greedy for asking one question about his will. I was simply asking for what he'd intended, what he'd carefully written into legal documents specifically to prevent the kind of favoritism Mom had tried to enact. I went to Dad's grave on the anniversary of his death. I brought flowers and sat in the cold December air, telling him about everything that had happened. "I kept my promise," I said quietly. "I made sure it stayed equal." I felt certainty that he would have been proud. Not of the family conflict, not of the pain, but of the fact that his wishes had been honored. Mom and I did eventually have that lunch. It was strange and uncomfortable and necessary. We talked about surface things at first, avoiding the deep wounds. But gradually, carefully, we started to talk about real issues. "I always thought Lauren needed more help," Mom admitted. "She seemed more fragile, more uncertain. You were always so strong." "Strength isn't armor, Mom. Strong people need support too. They just don't always show when they're struggling." She nodded, tears in her eyes. "Your father tried to tell me that. I didn't listen. He built the equalization clause because he knew," I said. "He knew you might favor Lauren. He protected against it legally because he loved both of us equally." "I thought I loved you equally," she whispered. "Maybe you did," I said. "But you didn't treat us equally. There's a difference." We left the restaurant without complete resolution, without perfect reconciliation. But we'd started talking honestly, which was more than we'd done in decades. It was a beginning. Standing at the cabin's dock in early spring, watching the ice break up on the lake, I thought about the journey of the past year and a half. About how one question at a Sunday dinner had unraveled years of family dysfunction and favoritism. About how Dad's careful legal planning had protected what he'd wanted when he couldn't speak for himself. They'd called me greedy for asking one question. But I'd never been greedy. I'd just been asking for what Dad had intended, what he'd written down specifically to prevent his daughters from being treated unequally after his death. The first installment payment would continue hitting my account monthly for the next 6.5 years. Not as revenge, not as victory, but as correction of an imbalance that should never have existed. Every payment was recognition that Dad had wanted both daughters treated fairly. My phone buzzed. Mom, asking if I wanted to come for Easter dinner. A year ago, I might have refused. Now I texted back. Maybe. Let me think about it. The power dynamic had shifted permanently. I was no longer the invisible daughter, the capable one who didn't need support. I was equal to Lauren in the eyes of the estate, in the careful legal framework Dad had created, and increasingly, in Mom's understanding of her own mistakes. I'd won, but not the way I'd imagined winning might feel. There was no triumph, no satisfaction in their downfall. Just a quiet certainty that I'd done what Dad had asked, that I'd kept my promise to make sure it stayed equal. Justice served.
Calm.
Legal.
Documented.
On my terms.